That's a relief. Okay.
Come and sit down this end.
Right, I'm going to start. We are a select few. I don't have any part of the administration of this, whatever it is, AMM 400 or whatever that means in the real world. I'm going to start with at the end. Why not? So, I think there's a lot of discussion in this department about music and its technologies. And the thing that I'm going to try and offer you today is probably a very different historical interpretation of that. What I've been asked to do is to talk to you about recordings as forms of evidence, how they can be deployed in musicological research. I don't do a lot of the kind of high-tech stuff that some of you guys do at all. I'm afraid I'm just a violinist who plays things mainly. But what I'm going to sort of try and connect you to is how aspects of historical recording. Hello, do come in and sit down unobtrusively. Thank you. So I'll try and show you a little bit of a whistle-top tour of some of the things that I sort of do to do with historical recording technologies. But the first thing I'm going to do is to play you 3 minutes of music. Have you done that? Fantastic. Do sit down and then I can start. That's marvellous. So I will play you this is an acoustic gramophone. It dates from about 1930. It's sort of the kind of more portable version of a thing with a big horn that sticks on the top, such as you get on the HMV label still these days. Okay? So there's a port down here, which is the recording port, which goes to this tone arm, which is a hollow tube. And you know, like any kind of turntable, it takes it from the stylus here, which is a slightly fearsome, thick thing. What we have here is a 78 RPM record. I'm going to play you this record in its entirety because I can't stop it once I've started. So this is 3 minutes of sound. Hopefully the memories again this lot is down. And then I'll talk to you a little bit about it at the end and what it is that you're listening to. Slow. That's better. Okay, so what you've heard there is an acoustic recording made non-electrically for all of the people, majority who appear to have come late. So it was made by a process that doesn't involve any electricity whatsoever. This was there are a series of processes before the year 1925 do come in. And then this is an example of it. What might surprise you a little bit is to learn that that recording was made in 2024. And I'm one of the performers on it. And indeed, I'll talk a little bit about what this is. So this is a new recording, believe it or not, made by one of about 3 people in the world who actually know how to make those recordings. And I'm one of a tiny handful of people who has, in living memory, had the privilege of actually working that way. Why would you want to do that? May well be a question that you would want to ask, but I will get to that a little bit later. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a very general series of slides that I'm just going to sort of wallop through very quickly, that deal with some of the ways in which recorded sound became an absolute game changer, not only to how people play or sing or whatever, and leaving aside as well the huge kind of vistas of discussion to do with musical cultures and the nature of what I think you guys tend to call the music industry, or what I call the music profession. But I'm going to talk a little bit about this from the point of view of so-called historical musicology. So most of you don't know who I am, which is quite extraordinary given the fact that I've been here for 17 years. It's partly because I'm here for 2 nanoseconds a week, 2 days a week, whereas I used to be very heavily involved in most things. So I am a violinist by trade and profession, so to speak. I teach the violin, I play the violin all over the place. I play the violin in what we would sometimes call modern instrument way, and sometimes in historical ways. And I write about historical string playing, and have done for a long time. But one of the things that hinges upon is, in fact, the technology of recording. So this probably will be very, very different from some other things that you've received on this, and that's the point, really, is to give you a window upon a different kind of way of thinking and the way that it applies to me. So in many ways, focus the impact, the importance of this on musicology. I'm going to discuss a case study a little bit later, in which that recording you've just heard will be very much part of it and is part of what that case study was. But just to start off with, I want you to put yourself in the mindset of what now we're obliged to call classical music, whatever that means, because that's the world that I inhabit, and how recordings can impact what we do as musicologists as well, because I like to consider I'm a bit of one of those. So I'm just going to run through this very, very carefully. So first of all, the ability to listen back is a massive thing. Before the invention of usable recording technologies, you are living quite literally in the moment. You cannot listen back. You cannot listen back over things. You can only actually physically be in the room with live musicians doing stuff, more or less. We'll leave aside various late 18th century clock pieces and other such ephemera. But basically, we've got that kind of thing. The key elements I put here is when, the kind of timescales that we're dealing with. Now, the earliest recording technologies, I'm not going to give you all of the facts here, we can all use Wikipedia, but late 1880s, we start to find recordings of musicians. But it's really only from about the year 1900 that those become really audible in any useful way. They're very difficult to hear. That's partly because they're very old, and they were not designed to last this long, so what you get is what survived. But also, it was pretty primitive, it has to be said, to start off with. But that chronology is longer than you might think. If you start thinking about who is on record, we're talking about really distant figures. The violinist Joseph Joachim was born in 1831, for example. Knew Milsom personally and learnt from him. Just to give you a case in point, there are recordings from the turn of the century of Edouard Collon and the Collon Orchestra of Paris, who premiered works by Berlioz, and Collon was a close friend of Berlioz. So you get the idea that we're finding evidence for even further back than that, due to the fact that rather
fortuitously, some of these people lived a thankfully quite long time, and long enough for us to do this. The whole idea of a composer authority changes when you can hear the composer either on the podium conducting it, famously and awkwardly in the case of somebody like Igor Stravinsky, who did things numerous times and very, very differently, and suggested that they were all exactly what he meant. Olivier Messiaen, the organist and composer, equally, there must be at least a dozen recordings of the Quartet for the End of Time that he claimed were, as it were, definitive, and yet all of them are radically different from each other. So it brings these kind of debates very much to the fore for those of us studying what we find on such recordings. And this is what this is about. But there are big limitations. What I've played you there demonstrates those. Now, of course, that was not ever designed to play in a big room like this particularly. There are much better examples of that technology for doing this. It's just the only thing I could physically carry this morning. But we have limitations in terms of the sound waves, the frequency range, all of those kind of things. That quotation there, which you will eventually get, is a very famous one which makes that point. We've also got the fact that actually physically doing it is not very comfortable, because you can't just stick a microphone somewhere that sort of works for the engineer and the musicians. By the way, I have plenty of experience doing that as well. But you have to effectively move the musicians to the equipment, and that can make things very awkward, and you'll see some examples of that a little bit later. There's also awkwardness simply in terms of sonically what you can hear, in terms of how well it represents sound. Some instruments were really easily captured, and some less so. Some particular practitioners of particular instruments were better captured by this technology than others, which is partly where this little quotation about violinists come from. More specifically, this has a cultural and stylistic impact as well. If you take account of the fact, for example, that Caruso, the famous singer, was particularly well adapted to sing in front of this kind of equipment. His manner of singing, stylistically, apart from just simply being able to hear the sound, became very influential. So in this sense, you're not just simply taking the sound in and creating, in this sense of the word, a record. You are fundamentally affecting and influencing musical history and how we perform. You know, why are most pop songs 3 or 4 minutes long? Well, part of the answer to that is also that this is the length of a single side of a 10, in case of a 3-minute side, or 12-inch disc. And the one that you've heard is a 10-inch disc. And that gives you a kind of sense that has affected art forms that appear to be totally disconnected from anything that I've talked about so far. But they are connected, I would argue. Anyway, here are some of the things. You've got very limited time length. That also affects what you hear. You know, if you want to hear a Beethoven symphony, it's difficult because you need lots and lots of records to do it with. We do have, the earliest recording we have was of Artur Nikisch in 1913, which is pretty early and a pretty long time ago and very interesting. But quite a lot of things that we might want to hear, because our tastes and our interests as musicologists and performers are such in the second quarter of the 21st century as we now are at variance with what could actually be done. So there are issues like that. You know, you've seen that. I mentioned here a particular kind of instrument, a Stroh violin, which was specifically designed to make sound effectively under these conditions. As soon as the electric microphone was rapidly adopted from 1925 onwards, it became obsolete. And there are surviving examples. I've always wanted to get my hands on one. If I find one on eBay at a sensible price, I will buy it. But at the moment, they're quite expensive. So there are all sorts of things like this. All of these things limit what we've got. Further limitations. If it's poor quality, it doesn't represent the playing faith. It's hard to hear. In the case of what you've heard there, you can hear a fair bit, but there are things that you probably can't hear either. And that affects anybody that you listen to. This is inconvenient because some of the most distant historical figures are the ones that historical musicologists are most interested in learning about, of course. So what has to happen, therefore, is a process of interpretation and deductive listening in order to try and reasonably deduce things from that and not others.
Hello.
Hello?
Are you using any of this?
No.
Okay, I think you are.
I'm not. I'm 100 years earlier than that technology, at least.
So, can I just ask you?
Yes, of course you can.
Strode violin
Yes.
had given a different effect to the recording you made.
Not noticeably.
Okay.
They're louder.
Okay.
But they tended to be used not by solo artists, but more in an orchestral context. They also, this is the other useful point as well, is it totally replaced some instruments with others. So, for example, you might, it's a bit like school orchestra really, you might not invite a string bass, but have, a tuba, for instance, playing the bass line. And there are loads and loads of sort of Italian opera orchestras from the early years of the 20th century accompanying famous singers. You hear this very umpa kind of thing. They didn't really worry about fidelity in the way that we did. And anyway, it was all about the star singer. But that was why, I think that was fundamentally why they were. When I've got my hands on one, I will be able to test that for myself. But I haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. Anyway, so you've got loads and loads of limitations, more limitations here, and so on. And if you want to, deduce something about how people played the violin in 1870, for example, or 1890, there are therefore reasonable doubts to be had. But what else have we got? This is the most vivid evidence that we have, and it totally changes our relationship with it. There are many, if you go to a music conservatoire, certainly in the UK, and you talk about historical violin, they immediately assume, even though this is 2026, that you're talking about Baroque violin. It's been Baroque violin since the 1960s. There's 30 or 40 years of research into other historical musics, which is still barely represented at all. I suspect things here because, and this is an interesting way in which politics gets into this as well, because if you don't know something, you can allege anything you wish and you can suit your own stylistic predilections. A number of scholars have suggested this about so-called historical performance. It's harder to do in the presence of recorded sound because we have a much more direct link to what people actually did, not necessarily in the concert hall, but in the circumstances they were in. But the big question then is, if you make a recording such as the one that I've played to you, is that radically different from how you would make it under other conditions? Until relatively recently, that was an unanswered question, but increasingly that question is being answered by the simple expedient of finding the resources and the people to actually do a present-day side-by-side comparison and a discussion with the performers as well. More on that in a few minutes. You get the idea. So is romantic performance therefore fundamentally different? Well, yes it is, because the supply of evidence we've got is different from the late 19th century onwards compared to earlier. That's all that is really. There is, of course, no such thing as an early recording because the technology differs massively. My good friend and colleague, Dr. Irina Stanovic, who was a research fellow here, currently working at the University of Surrey, she and I collaborate still on many things, would have it that almost everything varies. I heard some test acoustic string quartet recordings, which, by the way, when they're done properly, will again be groundbreaking because nobody's done that since the 1920s either, in which we listened on 3 different playback equipment, all acoustic, all of which gave a very different impression of the sound. And I think the best way of thinking about it is take any musical instrument of your choice, and a flute is a flute, only it's not, is it? They're all different. Equally, violins, 3 violins can be fundamentally the same sounds, but can convey a very, very different impression. Exactly the same thing happens with this. So we have an intriguing thought for you, which is that when you record this way, you are effectively recording a musical instrument into a musical instrument, which has the bell of a horn and captures vibrations on a wax disc. We then come into a room such as this and play it out of a musical instrument. So it's an interesting philosophical as well as practical thing. So there are lots of different technologies. I think that's the key thing. My own kind of work goes up to the invention of the LP in the 1940s, and of course tape of various sorts from then on, 1950s mainly onwards, and then of course into the modern digital age, which all of you guys here will know far more about than I do, very probably, but of which I make these recordings. But in terms of who is recorded, time is the factor, and therefore inevitably this privileges the earlier forms of recording that I've listed here. So just a few pretty pictures, whoops, went too far. That's an Edison phonograph. If you look there, you can see that at the bottom of the recording bell, as if you don't get reflection on the brilliantly placed light in front of screen. I wonder who thought that was a good idea. There's a kind of cylindrical thing, which is equivalent to the flat disc, but obviously in cylindrical form. These were much more compact. They behave quite differently. They're much more sensitive in some respects to record onto, but the fidelity of what you get out of them is generally less, partly because a cylinder is more easily able to be deformed, which can affect things like playback, intonation and stuff like that. I've made cylinder recordings as well, including in this very building, because we did some of that upstairs at a conference 2 or 3 years ago. So this is the kind of thing, and you can see Stroh violins here. You can see these horned instruments. But you can see, here is a large recording hall that is attempting to capture all of these musicians. In order to do it, you have to have them on the right level. So cellos, for example, are commonly raised up on platforms, as you can see there. A very smart gentleman there is addressing the cello straight in the recording hall, because actually these lower instruments were much more difficult to record. The higher instruments were rather better. But this is not an orchestra, clearly. This is a bunch of musicians, as such as they can get in and to fit. I forget who the conductor is. Do you recognise who that is? No, I'm not sure I can remember. It doesn't particularly matter for this purpose anyway. But you can sort of see what's going on there. By contrast, here is the same studio after the invention of the electric microphone, which doesn't look much like the modern one, but nonetheless is light years ahead of the other technology. And now you've got something that does more closely resemble an orchestra, albeit seated in slightly weird positions, because of just sort of how that's working. So that just gives you a little bit of an insight into what we're talking about. Here are more pictures. Elgar was one of the earliest born composers substantially to make use of recorder technology to document his own music. And you see examples of him doing so here. There are many famous recordings, some of which he re-recorded after 1925 by electrical means. One of the things as well, by the way, I should mention, and we'll mention later, is that if you've got a 3-minute side length, there are several things you can do with that. One of which is that you could just simply split the music into 3-minute chunks or 4-minute chunks. And latterly they did that. There were side breaks, they'd find a cadence or something, and then you turn the record over. But in the very early days, they would very commonly cut the music to fit the limits of what you've got. And this again is absolute anathema to the luxurious position musicians are in the present age, in which you just generally wouldn't do that. But the art, indeed, of where do you cut and how do you join things together is quite tricky. What you just heard, by the way, for some of you will recognise this, is the last movement of the Bach double violin concerto, albeit with a 19th century cadenza, which incidentally, as far as I know, has never been recorded acoustically until we did it 2 years ago. The only surviving recording I know of early these musicians was in fact an electrical one. But if you play the whole of that movement on its own, it's about 8 minutes long. The side we had was 3 minutes. We couldn't even record half of it on one of those sides and split it. We had to find ways of cutting the music. It's difficult. Bach's music is densely interwoven. We had to really work hard to find where to cut so that it wouldn't sound particularly dreadful. Some other forms of music, it's much easier to do that too. So again, that slightly privileges not only how you're hearing it, but fundamentally what you are hearing as well. So I hope that just gives you a bit of an idea of just how many of these issues there are when you look at it closer. The idea of definitive performance, to a certain extent is possibilitated by recording technologies. And there we go, I mentioned Messiaen earlier, is the obvious example. Recordings analysis, here's a pretty picture of different lengths of later than 5.
So is that total duration?
Yes, I believe it is, yes.
Pace,
Yeah, I think it's, exactly, I think it's basically length. There are lots of different ways of sort of measuring this. And all the rest of it. Here are some key works. Timothy Day used to be the curator of the National Sound Archive. I think he's still alive. I haven't seen him for many years. Robert Phillip, also one of the pioneers. His 1992 book births most of the interest, including mine, in this in the early 90s. And there's been a huge amount of musicological work since. So I've talked about these things already, alien environment, all sorts of issues. But if we start trying to do it ourselves, I'm going to whiz over this quickly because actually I've got another presentation which goes in more depth into this. We find that we can actually learn by knowing, by doing, experiential learning. Autodidacticism as well, learning of ourselves, autoethnographical things, how we respond under these different environments, allows us to have a much more intelligent understanding of what we're hearing on some sort of recording. Incidentally, another very important factor, again I can hear in my ear as I'm talking to you about this, is the problematic case of digital transfers. Because if you go, for example, if you were to put into YouTube Nickish Beethoven 5 1913, you would find an electronic version of that you can listen to very comfortably on your wireless headphones as you try and avoid getting killed in a busy street, for instance. Now, that's all very well, but who's done the transfer? Which discs precisely did they transfer it from? On what equipment did they do it? To what extent did they process that sound? And what is it? How are we hearing this? And we're hearing it electrically anyway. That is true, of course, as I'm sure you all know, in terms of making new recordings. I have 2 recordings intended for YouTube, so video as well, which are being worked on at the moment. We have to make sure that these things sound okay when you're not looking at the video, will sound okay just through a phone speaker or a hi-fi system or something else. These are not technical answers that I can give you because I'm not a recording technologist, but as a musician and as a performer and as a self-producer, these are everyday questions that we have to think about.
So, David, can I
Yes,
ask another
please do.
question? So, there's no compression,
Yeah.
obviously, so you've got that the sound world is different. And
Yeah.
As a pianist hearing on recordings,
Yes,
they're
very much
always
so.
mic'd a long way away, and so as a performer, it never sounded like the instrument that I was playing. If I hear recordings, because
Yes.
I hear it up close,
Yes, exactly. Well, you get that anyway, don't you, with the
get that
piano?
from your own
Other people hear a totally different sound than you do at the keyboard. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
I think that's one of the things with the orchestral recordings as well.
Mhm.
You've got room reverb, and of course,
That's right.
some places they prided themselves on recording in certain halls and stuff.
Yeah,
So you always got that hall sound.
exactly. Yeah, there's so many variables, aren't there?
And I suppose a lot of this is due to taste, hasn't it?
It has, and I think there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between all of these things. And I think it's curious, really, how. I mean, I'll give you a modern example actually, which is that we've recently. My ensemble has recently. Well, it was actually last May that we did it, but it's been taking a long time to get this far. But we recorded, among other things, Shostakovich's 8th Quartet, and with that, we have various different mixes between ambient mics and close mics. And between all of us, we were listening through to this, and I was thinking, well, I need to try and represent what we collectively think is better. And the first was actually quite a raw, relatively unprocessed, quite close mic, very unforgiving. You can hear chiffs and mistakes, and you can hear, but the music is so much more vivid than it is if you have more of the ambient mics in the mix. So we, in the end, with that piece specifically, we decided that we were going to go for actually quite a raw, a sort of unforgiving, sound. But we also recorded Tchaikovsky's Souvenir de Florence as well, which is a bigger texture, 2 cellos, 2 violins, and the music is more inviting of a more rounded approach. So with that one, the recording stuff will be very different. Now, this probably isn't radical at all to anybody else in the room, except me as a mere practicing musician. But it's very interesting how you deal with that. And to a certain extent, you've got much less control over that with acoustic sound, even really good ones. But you do have some. So, for instance, if you look here at this photograph, this is my first experiments doing it, just upstairs on level 2. you'll see a piano there. This is the piano currently in my office with a recording horn pointing to the soundboard. And the horn there is one that I still use to this day. It was specifically made for me because it suited the tonal properties of my violin and the way I played it. So it gives you an idea of what we've got. Modern microphones there because we made a simultaneous modern recording as well for research purposes. And in the foreground, that sort of beige thing is of course the wax disc onto which this is being recorded by a sapphire stylus. And those discs, by the way, are about that thick, and they have to be absolutely true because otherwise you don't get a proper recording. It's very easy to get a bubble in the wax, for instance. It's very easy if it's too cold, the wax is too hard and the stylus doesn't cut into it properly. If it's too warm, well, it's probably fairly obvious that would have a problem with wax. It is low tech but awkward to do. And that's one of the things I wanted to sort of foreground to you. Here are a few more views of the same thing. With that one as well, you can see actually, well, you probably can't from that angle, that we were playing a violin and piano piece, and I couldn't see the pianist at all. It's totally impossible. So we had to. That affected the way we played. I suggest I've written about this in various publications, suggesting that actually we play in a slightly more arpeggiated way because it's a little bit uncertain as to exactly where you begin. That, by the way, is an aspect of style that you hear. It's not just because of early recordings, but it's sort of like further encouraged by the affordances of these methods of doing it. More angles, just to give you an idea.
Did you choose not to use a grand piano?
Yes, because that is quite difficult. Yeah. There are pictures of a horn that sort of effectively goes through a right angle and goes down into it. I mean, we might well do, but the recording engineer didn't suggest that was a good idea. Actually, upright pianos were often used because they were easy. You could lift them onto platforms and do all of that kind of stuff with them. And in fact, the one that we're using there, which is my own, is about the right period for this. It dates from about 1910. And it also had slightly hard hammers, which have since been resurfaced, which were perfect for making these kind of recordings. They often shaved the felts on the hammers to help the sound come across.
Sure. Is it a Broadwood?
It is a Broadwood, yeah. About 1910, I think, 84 key instrument. But yeah, it was just perfect for that kind of thing. And here's some more of the equipment. We made you can see I'm wearing a mask there because we were in COVID times. We did manage, just on the right side of legalities, to do everything in this workshop. And that's actually, it was in Inya's premises in Sheffield at the time, so the piano came home for a while. More views of that. So we made an album of recordings which you can find. Now, much has been made about this new Huddersfield University Music Department starting a recording label. Well, it seems a bit of a shame because we already have one actually, because I started it and it's got at least 3 discs on it. One of which, in fact, is this, a disc of violin and piano recordings, some solo piano, some solo violin, made by the acoustic process, which has gained a considerable interest in terms of, learning how to make these recordings. And the kind of research hypothesis I've used is a simple, but I think a sound one, which is if what you are hearing coming out of the other end sounds similar to the historical documents that you were studying, ergo it's quite likely that what you were putting in the way that you are playing yourself is also very similar. And therefore, to a certain extent, I was very excited to find that all the things I've been fiddling around with for years seemed actually to get us quite close to what these things actually would have sounded like. That means that by a process of necessary hypothesis, but not particularly far-fetched one, hopefully, it can be surmised that some of the things that I've been doing actually gets us quite close to the style of playing, say, of the 1890s, which is something that I've been studying academically. And that of others too, by extension, as well. So that's what
strings you use?
At this time, it was more common for the upper strings to be gut, usually sheet gut, fairly thick strings. The steel E string sort of became popular from around 19 14 to 18 because of the First World War. It was preferred because you couldn't get hold of good quality gut strings quite so easily. So steel then, and then it's sort of, the fact that it tends to last longer and doesn't go out of tune as much meant that people then sort of almost like made that transference. It's quite interesting to think of my own relationship with newer technologies as a window on how other people deal with such things. This is an anecdotal thing. For years and years I have claimed that playing the violin in a concert or practicing is the one way of escaping the hegemony of the computer. But recently we recorded a new work in which there were no page turns. So I just thought, right, okay, I'll just get an iPad and a foot switch and do it that way then. And what I found now is that initial experience makes you think, well, that's good actually. It saves a lot of paper and it's really quite convenient and I don't have to lug it all around. So I am sort of slowly making that transference to the new technology. I think a similar process probably happens with musical instruments. That you stick with what you know because why change? And then after a while you think, well, actually there is a reason. Maybe you've got through 12 strings on the same day because they were a faulty batch and you say, oh, to heck with this, let's give the new technology a go. And I think that's basically how these things work. Anyway, I shall just quickly go on. So there's that recording that we made. So it is possible to make convincing acoustic recordings, I think. It's a unique experience like nothing else. Unless you've done it, you cannot possibly speculate about what you can hear and what it's like to do it. And I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Some aspects are hard to do. You can't really get dynamics to come out very well, so you make music in different ways. And therefore you have to use a wider span of what expression is. And that is a useful lesson for people to learn, even if they have no intention of doing this. It's an interesting object lesson to musicians to get outside the box of what they're used to, both practically, performatively, and indeed technologically, in order to see, so to speak, what's on the other side. There's a lot of text in here, I can't be bothered to read it, you get the idea, and then there are some references. Right, so that's that. Now, there's also, I'm just going to switch that off for a second whilst I transfer to the other. Let's put some of that stuff into actual practice by talking to you about a slightly more recent project. So the thing that's interesting about all of these things, in my view, is that things often arise for serendipitous reasons. There's the kind of thing that circumstances come together, shall we say, or don't. But we had a series of circumstances come together. First of all, I got an email from India Stanovich saying I'm thinking of doing this thing in Huddersfield. She was living in Sheffield at the time, where I live, and that she happens to know this recording engineer who lives in Sheffield. The only person in the UK who does anything remotely like this is actually very local. That helped to create the conditions in which she did a Leverhulme research fellowship here a few years ago, up to and including COVID year. Why is that actually going from the beginning? Can you? No. Okay, we'll wait for. Oh, it's gone to. It's got its knickers in the twist. Okay, we'll just let that sort itself out for a minute. I'll just talk to you a little bit about it whilst I am. So that was that. That was the first stage, and then we made this recording out of it. Now, in about 2023, I came to the realisation that a particularly good and very enterprising and interested violin student of mine was getting rather good and very committed and very interested in all sorts of things. And as part of that, I thought, well, why don't we play the Bach double violin concerto? This is a very traditional thing to do, by the way, for students and their teachers. But I'm not a normal person, so I wanted to do it differently, and she was not a normal person either. So I thought, right, what we're going to do is we will record it in a 19th century way, because that's more fun, and I've got a 19th century edition of this. And I've always wanted to play this cadenza. So on one Thursday evening I said, right, you've got 10 minutes to learn it, and I'll go in the other room, I've looked at it, I'll take 10 minutes to do it, then we'll get together and play this thing through. And that was actually the bit of music that you heard. And we did, we thought, this is fantastic, we've got to do this. She was as enthusiastic as me. So we decided that we were going to do this, we were going to do some concerts. We did a University of Huddersfield concert here 2 years ago, I think, and that we were going to record it. in a modern way, but on period instruments. More about that later. So we got what I grandly called this project, and it is indeed multidimensional for reasons that you will hopefully see. So these are the people. That's me. You know about Maria is my student. I still see she's poised to go to the Royal Academy of Music on a scholarship next year, but we're likely to do a lot of work together anyway. Ruth is my wife, who plays the piano. Jonathan Gewing is a PhD student here, and many other things, who also did that. Duncan Miller is the recording engineer, and many of you will have heard of Alex Harker. So these are the people who were involved in this little project. So just a few things about it. So the first phase then was to make a modern technology recording. After that, we decided to make an acoustic mechanical recording. This is kind of a sense that because that had gone quite well, we thought we'd do this. You know, I just thought fundamentally I thought it'd be fun, because I think research is allowed to be fun and sort of playful in a funny kind of way, and I wanted to do this. Of course, if I got this funded by a funding body, it probably still wouldn't have happened, and probably would never have happened, because if you want to actually do something, it's quite difficult to get the money out of. So you end up, most of the research projects that exist are the way they are because somebody's tried to design something that will fulfill funding criteria. I wasn't having any of that. I just put my own money into it because the number of hours it took me to do it was considerably fewer than the number of hours it would be going through all the mumbo-jumbo of a research bit. Anyway, you can quote me on that if you like. I don't care anymore. So this slide here represents one of the target recordings that we were particularly interested in. So we had a musicological stylistic focus here, and this is a recording by Arnold and Alma Rose. Arnold Rose led the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra and was a close, it was in fact the, I always get this the wrong way around, he was in fact the brother-in-law of Gustav Mahler, and his daughter here was, the two of them performed this work together. I'll play you a tiny bit of it, I think, hoping that it actually works. So this is an electrical recording. You get the idea. So that was a very interesting recording in many ways. His style of playing was quite distinct from hers. I mean, they're considerably different in age. So something like more than 40 years between them. And his style of playing was more or less an unadapted 19th century manner of playing. Quite a lot of sliding about on the string, not so much wobbling about. You know, quite an ascetic kind of sound. Hers was rather more modern. The story is, of course, as with all these things, around the middle of the 20th century, you know, rather tragic. Alma Rose, who was the subject of a documentary, perished in Auschwitz. Her father outlived her and ended up in London, where he gave a number of the National Gallery concerts with people like Howard Ferguson in the early 1940s. A very sad situation. It's very difficult not to be aware of that, in fact, when you're looking at these things. Particularly since the Joseph Joachim edition of this had his name expunged from the title page, because of course Joachim was Jewish. And this particular copy, the physical pages that we were using, was a Second World War German copy. So these things are never far from the surface, and it gives a kind of poignancy to all we do. But I digress. So yeah, and that's a little bit of the edition that I've just mentioned. It's got bowings and it's got slurs, and if you're not a string player, that might not mean a lot to you. But there's quite a lot of stuff here that reflects a style of practice from the 19th century rather than the 18th century. Is there anything else? There's a very different, I'm not going to bother playing this to you, but there's a very different style. I might play a little bit actually. A very, you know, a kind of modern instrument, modern style, which doesn't try to be historical, might sound look more like this. So you get the idea, that kind of sound world is the one that we tend to associate with, as it were, a modern style player playing on modern equipment. You know, you've got, you know, Quito's got a lot of bloom to that recording, there's quite a lot of verisimilitude to the sound, there's plenty of vibrato, you know, it's that kind of thing. But the kind of sound world that we're talking about stylistically and on gut strings is quite different from that. And of course, further to that, if you make an acoustic recording, you're doing it on a very different instrument anyway. So we recorded this work here, as it says, on the 9th of March, just over 2 years ago. I'll play you a little, I'll try and find the bit of the last movement. These numbers are so small, I can't read them. A bit further. Which is sort of around the same area of what you were listening to on the recording. So same players, modern technology. No, it's gone back to the beginning. Sorry. Let's get a bit further. It's just going into the cadenza. I'll play just a few bars of it. This is just before it, obviously. So that's what you heard it sound like on the modern recording. Same people, you know, different place, but that's sort of what you get out of it. And you can see there that we've recorded, see this is again where all of these things come in concentric. So we don't have an orchestra, we have, that's another Broadwood actually. Not many people know we've got that because nobody cares for it anymore, but it lives in the corner of St Paul's, and it's a really rather nice piano. Our piano technician absolutely hates it because it's a really difficult instrument to work on. But he got wheeled out quite literally to make this recording because a lot of recordings were made both electrically and acoustically with piano because it was cheaper and easier to do with the earlier technology.
It sounded like it's got smaller hammers as well.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, it's actually in the flesh. It's quite a solid instrument, actually. But it's a very different timbre. It's very much a 19th century kind of sound, actually, which is partly why we got it. Yeah, I hope we do get a chance to use it again. Anyway, so we did that. We made this recording, and we did that. So we did a live performance a month later. With the kids here in Huddersfield as part of a concert, which was fun, and we did it various other things. You know, we've got that. I don't know why that's exactly here. This is Pennine Records is the label I mentioned to you, and that is the artwork for the acoustic disc I did with Inya, which was a prefigured this other project that I decided to do. Yeah, there's more of it there. You can look it up. It's you know, it's on the university website. You should be able to find that, and it has free digital downloads of the various tracks. Do have a listen because some of I'm quite proud of it actually. It worked really well. And then, you know, from all of this kind of work, we develop an infrastructure. So the Early Recordings Association is a group of international scholars who go around looking at this, making these recordings, also interpreting and trying to understand this form of technology and the kind of methods that we can use in order to do so. So that was one of the things that created the... You can see here that it's beginning to develop a bit of momentum. I don't know why that was there. These things replicate what's on the other thing. You'll recognise this is a slightly different audience, so I'll just whiz through this. But the spatial issues of where the performers are is something you'll see in a minute. Now, the third thing is really important because this is a difference, particularly in comparison to what we were doing with the piano and the violin or the single sound source. You've got, in the case of this work, you've got a piano and you've got two violins. Now, the way it works is this. If you look at what we've got here, and imagine that this was acting in reverse, it wasn't playing out, it was taking in. You've got a stylus and you've got a tube. Effectively, the vibrations are captured, by this means, and it has to be captured by what the input. This is the output, of course, because it's a playback thing. But if that was the input, there would be the input. It would travel here, and it would emanate in terms of vibrations and grooves made in the soft wax surface. You can understand that. It's a very crude, but also extremely sophisticated process, because it has to capture the precise nuances, not only of an instrument but of a particular player. So all of this has to be set up with fantastic precision. Low tech always requires a high degree of complexity to make it work, and this is no exception. Now, well, I want you to imagine that if you've got one violinist, say, and they're playing in there, that's all very well. But if you've got two violins, basically what you've got is a kind of junction. You've got the bell of a horn, which comes in like that, the bell of another horn, which comes in, usually by a piece of rubber tubing, into the stylus itself. Now, this works a little bit. How many people here, you probably are too young, most of you, to know this, but in the old days, if you wanted to wash your hair, you stuck this kind of hideous rubber contraption on the bath taps, and you mixed the hot and cold water so that it was the right temperature, and you could spend hours shivering in your bathroom, turn the hot up a bit too much, scald it, turn it down, freezing cold. Really difficult to balance the hot and cold water feeds so that you get a comfortable temperature to wash your hair. Now, that is a very good analogy for what we're talking about here. If one person wellies it down one of these horns, it stops you hearing the other person. So, as musicians, you have to be fantastically aware of each other in order to do anything like this. And that is if you then add a further factor, which I demonstrated in this room, because both Ruth and Maria came and joined me about a year or so ago here, is that you've got a piano. But the piano doesn't, in this case, have a recording horn attached to it. It is picking up ambient noise in the room. In order to do that, you generally take the piano to bits. So you remove all of the outer panels. We, in fact, demonstrated it on that piano over there in February 2025. And you basically play as powerfully as you can in the hopes that you can get some of that sound across. Now, in this, it's not somebody at a mixing desk. It is you, the musicians, who are the mixing desk. So it's really quite, it's not that these things don't happen, it's that different people do it. And that is a really exciting thing to do as a performer, and it's a really tricky thing to do as well. So that's worth mentioning. You definitely can't edit it. If you stuff it up, you have to do another side. I paid for all of this, and I know exactly how expensive these discs are. It takes Duncan about 8 working hours to make a single wax master. So if you stuff it up, it's expensive. And it was expensive in those days as well. You would only invite the people into your recording studio in 1910 or whatever if you knew that they could do the job. And, you might also think, well, it's good enough. Yes, there's a mistake there, but we can put up with that. So quite a lot of these recordings have mistakes. That they were just as good musicians as we are. They could easily have avoided it, but it's a very different relationship with the musical text as well. And you have to play very differently for an effective recording. So here is a picture of us making the recording you heard in the beginning of this task. So you can see here the 2 recording horns, yeah? You can see here that Maria is sort of facing that way, and I'm facing that way. So we're sort of side by side, which looks very comradely, but we can actually see each other. Here is Ruth, and there is the piano, and there is all the recording equipment. So that's the kind of scenario we're working with. There's another view the other way. You can see the piano in the background there a little bit more easily. But that gives you an idea. So we almost have to be telepathic. Unfortunately, we played together such a lot. That wasn't difficult. It is difficult, but we could do it. So, she was only 16 at the time, right? This is quite an achievement, to be able to do that. And she also almost certainly the youngest person to make an acoustic recording since about 1923. It's just something that casually I thought was a good idea. This is how research can be sometimes. that rather garish blue thing is the wax. He tends to colour it because you can see the groove more easily. They used to do that. But you can see there's the stylus. This tube thing here looks like it actually has. It's quite dull, really. The idea of it is that it sucks up the wax swarf that gathers, so it doesn't clog and spoil the record. All of this equipment, which is made to models, very little of this original equipment survived because it was like trade secrets and they got rid of it. But of course, it was literally thrown away as soon as the electric microphone took over. So the guy makes all of this by hand. It's astonishing. In his little house in Sheffield, half an hour's drive away from where I live. It's an amazing thing. So then, of course, we got you've heard this before, but I will play a little of this. This is an electronic transfer of what you heard at the beginning, just for comparison of that as well. Actually, that photo better demonstrates the fact that we're not facing each other than the others, actually. It's just a little thing. It's up on our website. It's on YouTube, this stuff. Yeah, so actually I should be a frame earlier than that because I wanted you to see that photograph. If you just see just how close Maria's violin bow is to that. Now that is a thing because if you go up there you can hit the end of the horn. She didn't, but I did. I ruined one of them because I just slightly misjudged the distance. So all the stuff about this being uncomfortable, yeah, it's awkward. But then again, musicians play in orchestra pits. At this university about 15 years ago, slightly improbably, I was MD for a performance of Cabaret, and I spent a week standing on an orange box conducting in two, with half of the musicians going this way and half of them going that way, like in a bus formation, and the trumpets were about 50 feet in that direction, because that was the weird space that we got. And yet we made music, we made it work, because you do. And I think this is the thing, yes, it's uncomfortable, but to those of us who live in the real world and don't just sort of jet around from one amazing concert hall to the next with our entourage, this is okay. And you soon learn to adapt to it, and actually you don't find it that bad in the end. So there have been lots and lots of things that come out of this. This comes out of recording technology, so I may be getting off the point here, and you may be slightly losing interest in it, but the whole point is that we make a life for ourselves in music, isn't it? Right? And in order to do that, we have to earn money, because otherwise we don't live in a house. Yeah? And what this has done is birthed all sorts of things. It's brought together learning technology, a further strand of looking at prolonging and revisiting pre-existing aspects of academic research. That's the uni bit. The music performance bit is that this, I think, probably almost certainly is a unique training experience for my young student. I can't think of anybody else who's done this. Certainly I don't know of anybody else who's played on 19th century gut strings. And that was because of this project. This is how bringing things together, that's why I said multidimensional. It didn't just do that either, because we performed this on stage and thought, let's form an ensemble. So we did. And that ensemble exists. And today we have paid out £30,000 to performing musicians, young and less young, contributing to the livelihoods of local musicians. And that came from a little bit of pump priming money that I put in as a first 50th birthday present to myself. And a lot of that was actually inspired by this project, because we thought, let's do more of this. It also got, there she is, smiling away at you, into all of the conservatoires that she applied to and the National Youth Orchestra, because it's experiential learning and it's a way of looking in a multi-dimensional way at things. So I suppose, as I finish this bit of it, because I seem to have got there sooner than I'd feared I might do, there's lots of stuff we can learn from this. We can make side-by-side comparisons. If somebody says it was far too uncomfortable to record, you cannot possibly, you expect this to sound like the person, you know, in a concert hall, I can say, yes, you can, because I have done it. Yes, there are differences, but it's not like different people. And, you know, it's you know, you can actually take more from the recordings. It's a way of actually, you know, this is what we did. I've just said these things in the case of this particular project. We did all of these things because I wanted to, you know. I like my student very much. You know, she's amazing, and I wanted to try and help. It's hard enough making it in the performance world these days, and this was something I could do. So this is a practical output. This is where research, what do we call it here? Impact, I believe, is the term in the Research Excellence Framework. I don't know whether this is even eligible, but this is actual impact on an actual musician's life. So it can be done, even by little me. So it did all of those things, and here are a few references that gives you a bit of an idea. So this is a very different take on discussing the complexities of modern recording. But what I hope to have demonstrated in this little case study example is that recording technology in all its very many forms can have a very decisive impact on the cultures and practicalities of and the research of music in all its variety. I have talked about Western classical music. Unquestionably, there would be parallel cases for other musics as well. There it is. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I've got a question about the black cylinder.
Yes.
So you said it takes like 8 working hours, so we saw
Yes.
it being recorded, like the process of the grooving onto the wax.
Yeah.
What happens then? Is it baked? You know, how is
Yes.
it sealed?
I mean, the straight answer is, in great detail, I don't know.
Okay.
What we've created there is a wax master.
Yeah.
Now, this guy, who is, I mean, it's quite interesting, really, that this part of the world in England is, of course, well known for its small artisans, and so he is an example of that, because his house, which is an extraordinary place in itself, it's like visiting the 1920s going there. You know, in his garden shed, quite literally, he has the equipment for and the making of the physical discs, which effectively is creating a mould, a very obviously an extremely precise mould that takes that from the master, and you can generate any number of copies. What these discs, by the way, are usually, I'll have one around actually, because I mean, you know, it cost me extra, of course, but you know, he did the right thing by putting a proper record label on this thing. So you can read the centre of it. It's only a single-sided disc. But basically, the original material was shellac, which is a natural material, and it's extremely brittle. So in my office, for example, which is a sort of glorified storage unit, I've got loads and loads of these things, and if you drop them, they break into a million pieces. And they're very easily broken. These are not like that at all. This is a modern, you can't use shellac anymore because of, you know, ethics and stuff like that. This is a kind of, I don't know what it is exactly, but it's very tough material. It has very similar properties to record onto. So that is a bit of high tech in low tech. Again, it's interesting how all of these things align and coalesce.
And there's no degradation from the master
No,
when he makes a copy?
not at all.
Right.
So the record label is more or less the kind of thing. You can see the grooves in it.
Yeah.
It is possible to damage them, but it's more difficult than it is with a. Actually, it's more difficult than it is with a modern LP. They're really quite tough, which is quite fortunate. The equipment I've got here, by the way, obviously, as you can tell, I wind it up. the bit that you also, and this is an important research point, strangely enough, is that you have to change the stylus every single side you play. So if you were listening, you could do this. I had an evening with a friend of mine, Professor Christopher Dingler, Birmingham Conservatoire. He and I just decided, just on a whim, to listen to a Brahms symphony on 78 RPM record. I brought this gadget round, and we had lunch and a couple of drinks and stuff. And then we had to listen to this thing, and every 4 minutes, one of us had to get up, wind it up, change the needle, turn the record over. It was not instant listening. And I think for that reason, it's only comparatively recently, certainly since the Second World War, which you might type is comparatively recently, that you could actually just have recorded sound in a way that creates a surrogate for live performance. Even at this time, it was not the same thing at all. And it was like a kind of an impression of something, a remembrance of a piece or an artist. But it was not in any sense a way that would replicate it. So yeah, it's gloriously low tech and quite inconvenient to use actually as a consequence of that. But that in itself is quite an interesting bit of social history, I think. That I think is very easily overlooked. But yeah. Any other thoughts? I sort of assumed that there might be, which is why I finished it. I really put my foot down in the talk, thinking that it doesn't have to be, of course.
That's what the stylus is made of?
The stylus itself is is steel. It's just tips.
It's only one blade.
Yeah,
3
it
minutes
says
of life.
this is original. You can get these on the internet.
Yeah.
This says quite explicitly, use each point once only, it says. I have to admit that I don't always do that. And I bet they didn't either.
This
But,
must have been very expensive for people. So
Oh yeah.
So people didn't have access to music.
No, absolutely not. And I think the thing is, in terms of social music making, in the 19th century, the piano, of course, was the domestic. But that was only for wealthy people because they were expensive. But this part of the world, of course, for those of you who don't know, thank you. Brass banding was a kind of working class art form, still is in many respects. But even beyond that, singing. So choirs were a major source of this. It was only those who were more wealthy. I don't know much about this because I was born fairly recently, but my grandfather, who was born in the early 1920s in Sheffield, recalled his stories as learning the violin. Again, an interesting social. He's actually captured in Britain somewhere because I talk about the long 19th century and the fact that he was at the end of this kind of process. He had a teacher who ran a fish and chip shop and gave some violin lessons on the side. And when he was deemed to be not really up to it anymore, he went to another rather more serious teacher who used, for all of his teaching, the 1833 violin Schüler by Louis Spohr. So some of this much earlier stuff lasts a lot longer. And I think that's the thing, really. The recordings actually show a time span far bigger than, the one that's already pretty big, isn't it? I mean, the 1880s to the present day is a lot of time, 140 odd years. But in reality, in terms of the nature of the music, it's that. So, I mean, I suppose this is the point. That most of my career has been spent listening to recordings and analysing them. You can do that in increasingly sophisticated ways. I've written about this quite a lot. My PhD involved, you can do it so easily now, but back in sort of the late 90s, tapping along in order to measure tempo, interrupted values was quite tricky to do. And it involved, taking an Apple laptop and a MIDI interface and a keyboard, all this kind of stuff, lugging them around to various places to listen to gramophone records in order to look at styles and performance. Nowadays you can just do it on anything, really. But I did a lot of that as a way of putting into context things that you read about and things that you see on the scores and stuff. But the thing is that has been really fascinating is seeing in a recent small handful of years, some of us now looking at that process a bit in reverse, or rather looking at it backwards and forwards,
that little project that I did with Maria is an illustration of that, really, that we look backwards and forwards, and created something that I think is actually pretty good. The instincts to create that on period instruments, you know, in the 21st century, having had no prior experience of that whatsoever, you know, sets one up quite well, I would argue, even if you have no interest in it. Fortunately, she did have interest in it, otherwise we wouldn't have done it. But that's the case in point. Future plans, there is a plan at the moment to do a new string quartet recording, which would be very interesting because we don't know very much about even where the musicians would have sat. So there's a lot of experiential learning. We did a test recording about a year ago as well. And that's going to be interesting. The idea of this project, which I'm rather hoping that the university will give me some money towards, otherwise my pockets, as ever, have to try and pretend that they're deeper than they actually are, yet again, is to record an item of repertoire that was in fact recorded in 1911 by the very famous German Klindler string quartet, one of the earliest string quartet recordings on record. We intend to then purposefully emulate it and copy it stylistically as much as we can, and then record it by what we think are similar means, and then compare and contrast the differences in order to test effectively our research work and whether the conclusions that we come to are accurate or not. But I don't know. I think that gives you a bit of a flavour as to how recordings can be both subject and object. And since that sounds reasonably well thought out and elegant, I think I'm going to finish there. And thank you for listening. Thank you. Thank you. 7 minutes early. Goodness me, that's never going to happen again. How extraordinary. Covered now. Next house. No, just in a junk shop in Sheffield. About £50 20 years ago. It worked perfectly. There was absolutely nothing wrong with it. There are bits that we have to deal with. There's this head detached. But there's a kind of, as you can see there, there's a steel diaphragm, and then there are rubber seals, so which with age perish and go hard horrible. So, you know, they're not maintenance free, certainly not after a century or so. But yeah, it's pretty tough technology, so it still works perfectly. 78. With this one, I don't know whether the dial's wrong or whether it's getting a little bit tired or something. I'll have to set it slightly higher to be at 440. Yeah, there's a big like front spring. Exactly. I mean, it's beautifully engineered. It's not for me. What are you? Thank you. Nice day. Shopper.
They're a very quiet lot, so.
Yes, well, they usually are here. So I'm grateful for your question.
I didn't mean to monopolise it, but.
No, I'm very glad that you.
No, I think it's fascinating. Some of us are old enough to have grown up with, you know, grandparents 78
Yes.
records and
Well,
stuff.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got quite a few of my grandparents' ones actually.
Yeah. Because we chucked them all out, whereas we should have kept them. But anyway.
Well, that's always the thing. I mean, you never know what you got, because I've got It was quite funny, really. I acquired a large collection of these things
Yeah.
from, I don't know, it was a nunnery or something. It was a group of nuns, and they were moving because there were only about 3 old ladies left, and they had this fabulous 19th century Pugin design building. It was wonderful, and they were getting rid of this collection. It was somewhere in Worcestershire, I think, years and years ago. So I don't know how they knew that I existed, but they got in touch with me.
Right.
And so I went down and met, you know, the superior who greeted me very warmly and showed me this beautiful room full of all these things laid out on tables. And I picked some and I said, these are beautiful condition.
Yeah.
And she said, of course they are, we're nuns. But I still have those, they're upstairs, but I've not had any time to catalogue them.
Wow.
So I don't know what I've got, and some of those things may well be the only surviving
That's what
copies.
you need a research grant.
So yes, exactly, yes,
Wow.
absolutely.
Now, have you got time for coffee?
I don't. I have to go back. I've got Classical Sheffield, there's some strange organisation that administers concerts. Much against my better judgment, I appear to be a trustee. I've no idea what that actually means because I've missed all of the other meetings
Okay.
because I've had concerts.
Well, it might
So I have to rush back and actually attend this one.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a very kind thought. I will definitely take you up on that at
We'll
some
do
point.
that one day.
Yeah,
Yes,
I
I'll
like
leave
that.
you.
Yeah. Yes. But actually, just talking shop briefly,
Yeah.
there are 2 performances that you need to do,
Yeah.
and I've been sort of vaguely booked to be involved in that process. Now, I don't know how
Yeah.
far that's got yet.
Yeah.